Excuse me, I'm the cameraman too, so. Alright, I'll be hopping around a little bit. I want to read two stories. The first one takes its title from the name for the wild woman of the woods along the Pacific Northwest coast, Zuniqua. I like to Google things, travel destinations especially. Petersburg, Paris, the Bernese Oberlands, Mexico, Hawaii, all over the place. Or spots closer to home, places like Mount Shasta, up to British Columbia. Or say Cape Perpetua, for instance, where we were staying for a week in mid-December because I typed in vacation rentals and Yachats, Oregon, and found this huge $1 million cliff house overlooking the rocks and surf and horizon of ocean. Phyllis loved the sea. The website said, relax and savor the seclusion of this fabulous new 3,000 square foot villa on a breathtaking bluff between Cape Perpetua and the picturesque village of Yachats. You will watch sea lions frolic in the wild waves and gray whales breach as they migrate. The estate is located on 3 wooded acres with beach access nearby. The warm, rich colors along with plush furnishings will make you cozy, while the ocean views from every room will stir your imagination. Bring your books or your buddies and leave your cares behind. We brought our buddies, Brian and Sandy. We were a little tired of books, Brian and I. It was the end of fall term at the State University of New Geneva, and we felt like a short break from the written word. He taught in the university's business school, and I taught economics in the College of Arts and Sciences. He was one of my closest friends on the Soong faculty. When I realized the palatial nature of the house we'd be renting, I immediately thought of inviting him to go with us. With his wife, of course. My own better self didn't mind. She liked company. There were elegant, leaded glass windows throughout the house. A pair of them in the soaring atrium depicted natural scenes in glorious colors. They were elaborate and on the same scale as the enormous stained glass windows you find in medieval churches. The first of these translucent mosaics showed a group of gray whales in various poses, spy hopping, spouting, fluke shot while diving back under the waves, and so forth. The second scene portrayed a welter of seals and sea otters cavorting in the frothy surf. Sandy was enthralled by the beauty of these glass works. She was a passionate soul and stopped in her tracks with her mouth agape when she first entered the house. She finally murmured, "What magnificence." I said, "Yeah, it's hard to believe we almost killed them all off." She gasped and looked at me like I'd kicked her in the stomach. I didn't care. I didn't want to pretend it hadn't happened. I persisted. The fur trade almost exterminated them. It goes way back. The Vikings were down in Constantinople trading furs from Russia as early as the 9th century AD. The nobility and clergy all over Europe wore furs as a sign of high status. Ermines, sables, foxes, martens, beavers, and even squirrels, they were all made into garments for the high and mighty. Nobody else was allowed to wear them. Later on, wealthy commoners were also buying them. When the population of fur-bearing animals was reduced down next to nil, they looked to other continents for other furry creatures to kill and skin. Raccoons and possums were added to their repertoire, and after they killed off most of the beavers in America, they went after the otters and seals. The Russians were driven across Siberia and into Alaska in search of fur. The British and French pushed out across America to find more animals to slaughter. The early history of Europeans in this corner of the world was largely based on the desire for more fur. She looked at me like she was going to faint, like she was the heroine in a 19th century novel or something. I proceeded relentlessly. They clubbed the baby fur seals to death, you know. The otter would sometimes chew off its own foot to get out of the trap it was caught in. She said cautiously, "You know a lot about this." I shrugged. I'm an economist. It's the economic history of the place where I've lived my whole life. She looked like she wanted to throw up. She was really a very beautiful woman. She was Brian's second wife, blonde and young. It seemed like the business school guys always had the trophy wives. They always seemed to trade up when they hit middle age. Not that I cared. I loved my wife. I just couldn't help noticing, that's all. Maybe I'm exaggerating. I continued. Whales had been exterminated from the Mediterranean before the fall of ancient Rome. Then they hunted them in the Atlantic and Arctic. And when they killed them off there, they moved on to the Pacific and Indian Oceans. Whale oil fueled the street lamps and oiled the machines of Europe before the gas and petroleum industries came along. Whalebone went into their corsets, umbrellas, whips, fishing rods, and cutlery handles. By the beginning of the 20th century, the speedy steam-powered whaling ship and the exploding harpoon which exploded inside the whale's body made it technologically possible to kill more whales than ever. Gray whales like these here almost disappeared. They've only recovered slightly and might still become extinct if we ever do go back to hunting them again as relentlessly as we did. I didn't actually say all this to her. Or any of it, really. It's what I would have said, if I did. What I replied was just, yes, they're magnificent. She beamed her gleaming smile at me. Brian came in with a couple of suitcases in hand. He looked strong, hugging those heavy bags. He said to me, nice place, you know how to pick them, buddy. Phyllis came in with a suitcase and smiled at me. I was glad to see the flecks of gray in her hair and the little wrinkles around her mouth and eyes. I'd tell her all about the fur trade later when we were alone. She wouldn't mind hearing it again. Sometimes I get spooked, especially when people start talking about ghosts and eerie visitations from spirits. This is one of the very few secrets I've kept from Phyllis. She's known me since childhood, but she doesn't know this. It embarrasses me to admit it, I guess. We've been married for 4 decades, give or take, and she's always been very understanding of my weaknesses and foibles. Well, almost always. Within reason, But I've never wanted her to know about the way I get the creeps sometimes. I'm afraid no matter what she tells me, she'll think it's unmanly. I still want to be her hero, so I keep it to myself. The problem with this is that she doesn't know she should avoid certain topics. She likes to fool around with a Ouija board, for instance. A saucer inside a circle of letters and numbers will do as a substitute when away from home, and that's what she resorted to there at the Oregon coast. The second night we were there in the cavernous house overlooking the sea, Phyllis talked everyone into a little seance, just to amuse ourselves, of course. Sandy had been talking about reading other people's thoughts. The conversation then passed from mind reading imperceptibly over to ghosts, from ghosts to spirits, and somehow from spirits to people being buried alive. Brian told us about a corpse turning around in the coffin. It didn't seem strange, therefore, when Phyllis put a saucer out of the cupboard and showed how to use it to converse with the dead. She really believed in this. She was a highly educated woman, a talented architect, and a serious professional, but she had complete faith in the supernatural powers called forth in this way. For my part, I played along. When my turn came, I called up the spirit of my grandpa on my father's side, Hiram Johnson Benson, who'd gone by his middle name. Phyllis said one couldn't call up a specific spirit with a Ouija board, but I did it anyway. I asked Grandpa Josh the following question mentally. Is it time to get out of our science and technology fund and move the money over into our international fund? His spirit apparently spelled out the word no. I thought to myself that many things in nature are mysterious and that it's not the dead, but the unknown that's terrifying. A little later, when I was lying with my wife on the king-size bed upstairs in the dark, I couldn't shake the feeling that Grandpa was watching me. I listened to the heavy breathing of my sleeping spouse and was sort of reassured by it. Not enough, though, to keep me from pulling the blankets up over my head and hiding like a scared little boy. The image of the corpse turning around in the coffin wouldn't leave my imagination. Before long, it was joined by young Jimmy, who lived down the block from me when I was growing up in Fairfield, and who drowned in the public swimming pool. He'd slipped back out from the dressing room after swimming lessons when no lifeguard was around and had sunk like a stone. Then Professor Cummings showed up, the historian who, after a long and distinguished academic career, had jumped off the 10th and top floor of Taylor Hall, the tallest building on campus. This happened during my first year as a fledgling professor at SUNG, and it made a huge impression on me. All the while, the house continued to make night noises that made me cringe and squirm involuntarily. I thought of Grandpa Josh again. On this trip to Yahat's, we'd driven right by the cabin in the Coast Range where he'd lived during his last 20 years in this world. After he died, my parents inherited the place, and I used to go out there by myself. One time I decided to spend the night on the mountainside behind the cabin. I'd wanted to sleep in the loving arms of Mother Nature. The mountain was named Bald Mountain, really, no kidding, and my night on it had gone badly. I don't know what had filled me with terror there that night on that side of the mountain, but I'd panicked about midnight and it crashed back down through the rainforest in the total darkness. I've never felt like telling anyone about that failure of nerve. Phyllis didn't know it ever happened. My eyes had adjusted into the dark in the bedroom of the house at Yahat's, and I peeked out from under the blankets just to feel daring again. There was enough light from the porch coming through the bathroom windows that I could see the mask hanging on the wall opposite our bed. It had sunken eyes and cheeks and matted hair. It was shiny black. Phyllis had commented when we first laid eyes on it, "That's a Zuniqua mask, the wild woman of the woods. It's Kwakiutl, I'd say." She knew a lot about the art of the Coast Indians. She added, "Zuniqua might snatch your children if they wandered out in the woods, or she might make you rich. She could bring your dead loved ones back to life just by touching their bare bones." The Kwakiutls feared and loved her both. I said, "It's a beautiful piece." Now it was staring at me with the penetratingly empty eyes. I felt like it was going to take control of my soul and unman me utterly. If I let that happen, there'd be no hiding it from dear Phyllis this time. I had to do something, so I covered my head with the blankets again and gave up any further thought of boldness for the night. Phyllis asked me a couple days later, "You know where this place reminds me of?" We were sitting together side by side on the big couch in the living room with a truly magnificent view of the crashing surf and the milky white light through the clouds. Brian and Sandy had bundled up and gone for a long afternoon walk. I replied, "Where?" She said dreamily, "That big house at Hood River that we rented last June." That was another place I Googled up for us. It was just as grandiose as this house and even bigger. It sat on a high bluff overlooking the Columbia Gorge. I asked, "How so?" She answered, "The magnificent vista, the power of water." I said, "I see." We were silent for a minute. She said, "The gorge was created when all the water from Glacial Lake Missoula, Glacial Lake Columbia, Lake Lewis, and Lake Condon drained out all at once." She'd told me this before, more than once, but I didn't mind hearing it again. She liked to say it, and I wanted her to enjoy herself. She continued, "This happened over and over between 15,000 and 13,000 years ago during the last ice age. The water in Lake Missoula would rise for a few years until it was deep enough to float the ice dam at the Clark Fork River, and this wonderful flood would happen that tore away chunks from the volcanic basalt plain and carved out the beautiful Columbia Gorge. The water was 1,000 feet deep when it reached the gorge. It carried the rich farmland from eastern Washington to the Willamette Valley, while Without the Missoula floods, there would have been no Oregon pioneers and no Oregon Trail. Our families would have stayed in the Midwest, yours and mine. We might never have met. I said and smiled. When you put it that way, we owe a lot to those floods. The Scabland coulees make braided patterns across the Palouse. That's owing to the Missoula floods, too. She smiled back at me. You wouldn't be teasing me now, would you, my dear? I reached out and ran my fingers through her short black hair. My eyes ran up and down her slender body and her tight sweater and jeans. I said tenderly, of course I am, my love. I kissed her softly and then hard. She responded with more and more pleasure. She looked up at me. I'll have to talk about huge floods more often. I said, please do, and kissed her earlobes and neck. We made very good use of the large, comfortable couch and of the hour and a half before our friends returned from their hike. On the last evening of our stay, we drove the few miles up to the Adobe, a very nice seafood restaurant right on the beach. As we were sitting at our table finishing our scampi di ferri, vegetable fettuccine, filet mignon, and grilled Yaquina Bay oysters, we were feeling expansive. The fine Oregon Pinot Noir loosened our tongues even further. Brian was especially enthusiastic about the wine and ordered a second bottle when we'd emptied the first one. The conversation wandered. Brian asked at one point, after we'd collectively polished off the blueberry cobbler, lime sorbet, cheesecake, and truffles, who can say what love is? No one volunteered an answer. I, for my part, figured that it was a rhetorical question and that he'd be telling us soon enough. He continued, proceeding to answer his own unanswerable questions. Sure enough, love is just one form of desire, and like all desire, can be very destructive. I felt like being silly and offered subversively, economic demand is another. Brian smirked at me. Phyllis contributed, or a natural disaster is, like a giant flood, for instance. Sandy wondered, how is that a form of desire? Phyllis insisted, I think it is, and winked at me. Brian noticed and smiled appreciatively at us. He revealed, I was stalked once. Sandy urged, you mean Lily? Yes, tell them about Lily. She was a crazy biche, pardon my French. He began to explain, l'amour fou, you know. She was crazy in love with me. Sandy asserted that wasn't love. That was just obsession, mental illness, not real love. You can't call that love. He disagreed, but I think it was. Love isn't always pretty or nice. No, you'll never convince me that was love. Tell them about it. Let them decide whether that psychotic woman was in love or not. I interposed, so what happened? They talked me into teaching summer school one year, and I met her on campus. She was a 38-year-old school teacher back for professional development. This was after my divorce and before Sandy and I got together. Thing led to thing, and I wound up sleeping with her. Then she wouldn't go away. She had a husband, 2 kids, a house in a nice suburb, but her life was loveless. In her mind, I was her salvation, or her love for me was, that is. About that time, I met Sandy, and Lily lost her grip on reality. Sandy told us with horror, she threatened my life. Sandy was still just 28, talking to the 2 of us, 60-year-old men and my 59-year-old wife. She was a full-time homemaker and passed her days among pleasant, polite people. Brian's salary was equal to mine and my wife's combined. This was not a reflection on how we were esteemed. Business professors just make a lot more than toilers in the economics department do. It's assumed the former are taking a big pay cut by deigning to remain in academia. It's presumed the latter aren't. For this reason, there wasn't any pressure on Sandy to work outside the home. Brian didn't want her to, she didn't want to, and that was that. Ditto for kids. Brian had already done that with his first wife. He didn't want to spend his golden years doing it again. The alarm on Sandy's biological clock hadn't gone off yet, so they were in agreement about kids for the time being. Brian resumed. Lily became insanely jealous. She thought that if she kept at it, I'd eventually come around, but when Sandy came onto the scene, Lily just lost it totally. She made threats, and we were worried about Sandy's safety. I commented, "She sounds like a demon." Phyllis said to Sandy, "You poor dear." I asked, "So what did you finally do? How did you convince her to leave you alone? She's not hiding here in the restaurant watching us, is she?" Brian replied, "Never fear. She took herself out of the picture permanently. She drank cleaning chemicals from under the sink. It took a week in a hospital for her to die. I confess I went to visit her. It's hard not to feel guilty when someone harms herself because of love for you. She looked awful. The chemicals ate away her gums, so when her mouth came open, her teeth stood out like fangs. They had her drugged up so she didn't suffer much." Phyllis said, "That's awful, her poor husband and children." Brian asked us, "So what do you think? Was that love?" Phyllis gave me a look, and I understood that I was to be our representative. I answered, "Well, I think you were right the first time. Who can say if something is love or not? Who can say what love even is?" Sandy said, "You'll never convince me that was love. I can say what love isn't, and that wasn't love. No way." When my wife and I were back in the big bedroom later that night, I said, "I hope I'm the one to die first. I don't want to be left without you." "Because you love me?" "Yes, because I need you." "What about me? I don't want to be the one left alone in old age either." "If you love me, you'll let me die first." We laughed cheerfully. I said with phony gravitas, "Okay, all right, you can die first." She offered, "Of course, we could die at the same time. That would solve it." I said, "Or we could live forever. Problem solved." She proclaimed, "You're a genius, my love." I agreed. "I know, it's true." We chuckled and spooned on the bed, while the mask of Zunaqua gazed at us darkly from the wall. I reached back behind me and turned off the lamp. The pressure of my wife's firm ass against my genitals felt wonderful. So much so that after a minute or two, I noticed a considerable stiffening where there had been none. I suggested she didn't really need her pajamas bottoms, and she dutifully removed them. Thing led to marvelous thing, as so often happens with true love.